Hey guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here, and this is a really exciting day for me because I'm finally finished reading Chuck Austen's run on Uncanny X-Men. This is Volume 6, Bright New Mourning. And the reason I'm so excited is because if you've seen any of my videos where I've talked about this run, I have not enjoyed reading this run. And this has been very strange for me because when I first started, I kept saying this run isn't as bad as people say. And I still maintain that that's true. A lot of people, basically anyone who's ever heard of Chuck Austen, they are going to say that the Draco is one of the worst X-Men stories of all time. I'm going to strongly disagree. I think that She Lies with Angels and Holy War are both worse stories, and I also think that everyone who has an opinion about the Draco didn't actually read it, or if they did, they weren't really paying attention, since the reveal in that story isn't actually what people thought that the reveal was. But that's neither here nor there. I've already talked a lot about that. But even though I went into this run saying it's not as bad as people say, it's still not a great run. This run is not very good, and so I'm really happy to finally be done reading this run. And I'm not done with Chuck Austen yet because, as I said, I think in last week's video, after Uncanny X-Men, he went over to Adjectiveless X-Men, and he had another run that lasted a couple of volumes, so there's still some more Chuck Austen stuff out there, and I'll get to that someday in the future. Not immediately, because for the next 2 months or so, I'm going to be talking about Chris Claremont's Extreme X-Men. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that right now. So that's what you have to look forward to from now for a little while. But for now, I need to talk about Bright New Mourning. Now, this is a stranger story than any of the others in Austen's Uncanny run, because this is actually 3 separate storylines. And I don't mean in the Draco, you had a couple of different subplots. You had a subplot of Northstar and Juggernaut going to visit Sammy Pear, and then you had Iceman and Havoc and Annie kind of having a little tiff, if you will, with each other because of Annie deciding that she is in love with Alex and not Iceman. And you had all these subplots going on that were carrying over from issue to issue. So if the storyline was 6 issues long, the subplots were running through all 6 of those issues. That's not what's going on here. This book collects Uncanny X-Men 435 and 436, 442 and 443, and New X-Men 155 and 156. So it's 3 short storylines, and the first storyline is the trial of the Juggernaut, because in the Draco, I believe it was the Draco, the Juggernaut, he goes to Sammy's house and he beats Sammy's father, and then Alpha Flight captures him. And then the first two issue storyline here is the Juggernaut not even going to trial. It's basically he almost goes to trial, and then the Canadian government says, because of this, and this, we're not going to make you go to trial. And it's kind of a stupid story. Basically, we find out that Cyttorak has given his powers to another host, because the only reason that he actually gave his powers to Kane was because he thought that Kane would be a servant to him. We thought that Kane would actually be a good host for the powers of Cyttorak, and he would be a very potentially destructive force on planet Earth. And he was for a little while, but then when you have this guy who is a potentially destructive force, and then he joins the good guys, he's no longer a potentially destructive force. And so Cyttorak gives his powers to a new host. And that was an interesting idea that is ultimately spoiled here. It's not even used in any good way, really, because at the end of this 2-issue arc, we find out who this new host is. And it doesn't make any sense at all, because it's a little kid who, when his helmet is removed, he becomes a little kid again, which doesn't make any sense because the Juggernaut's power is not in his helmet. The Juggernaut got his power from touching a ruby. And so it doesn't make sense that this little kid is like Shazam from DC Comics. That doesn't make any sense. But we also find out that this kid was actually a neighbor to the Xaviers when Juggernaut was a little kid. And so apparently this kid has been a little kid for like 20 years, and then Cyttorak gave him his powers and then kept him as a little kid. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. Once it reveals who this new Juggernaut is, it just kind of skips over all of that and pretends like it didn't happen. This whole thing basically feels a lot like it's ripping off the trial of Magneto, which was a very similar story. You have a former supervillain who is now allied with the X-Men, and now he has to go and face all of the crimes that he committed as a supervillain, and he's trying to say, I've changed, you just have to give me a chance. And that's kind of sort of what we've got going on with the Juggernaut here, only it's handled much less good than it was in the trial of Magneto. As I've said throughout this run, Chuck Austen has a tendency to be really pretentious and think that he's being really clever with the subject subject when actually he's just being really sophomoric. For example, with religion in the Holy War storyline, or with Darwinism in the Dominant Species storyline, it's kind of coming back to a lot of that here. We have these two lawyers, they're kind of arguing with each other about should the Juggernaut get a fair chance. One of them says no, absolutely not. The other one says, but look, these are all the good things that he's done. And it really feels like it was written by a 13-year-old. And I'm not trying to be mean-spirited, but it doesn't feel like it's very smartly written at all. And that's because it's not very smartly written at all. And also, this storyline shows the Juggernaut sleeping with She-Hulk, which made Dan Slott mad enough that he then retconned this story and said that wasn't our She-Hulk, that was actually a She-Hulk from an alternate reality who somehow came to this world and was pretending to be our She-Hulk. So I haven't read any of Dan Slott's She-Hulk run, but apparently this particular reveal made Dan Slott angry enough that he wanted to address it in his own She-Hulk run. So that's something that you can check out there. I don't know the specifics of it. But basically, first two issues are the trial of the Juggernaut. It's not really very good, but at least it finally addresses what happens when a supervillain goes to join the X-Men. Do the X-Men just pretend like that supervillain is no longer a supervillain and everything's A-okay and the world just has to deal with it? No, that supervillain still caused a lot of damage all over the place, and there's one particular moment here where one of the lawyers, I think it's She-Hulk, or it might actually be one of the other lawyers, is listing all of the different crimes that the Juggernaut has committed. And it's like, you know what, just because we know that the Juggernaut has changed his ways and he's no longer a bad guy doesn't mean that he gets to avoid the consequences of what he's done. Except that at the end of this storyline, it does mean that. He does get to avoid all the consequences of what he's done. He doesn't have to do 40 life sentences anymore, basically just because Sammy's mother comes in and says, you know what, even though I was scared of the Juggernaut, I want to say that he's not that bad of a guy, which is completely out of character with how she acted every other time that she showed up in this series, where she was scared to death of the Juggernaut, and she didn't want Sammy anywhere near that guy, and now all of a sudden it's like, well, because my husband was abusive, I like the Juggernaut because he likes Sammy. And that doesn't really work with the way that her character was presented before, but again, it kind of feels like it's written by a little kid, and a little kid would say, well, suddenly we need something to come in so that the Juggernaut doesn't have to go to prison and he can stay with the X-Men. It doesn't really work, but then again, nothing in this run really works. The second two issues here are the two issues from New X-Men, which immediately follow Grant Morrison's run. And I have very little to say about those two issues because they really don't matter at all. They feel very unimportant. If you've read Grant Morrison's New X-Men run, or if you haven't, either way, you should know that at the very end, Cyclops is ready to just call it quits. He's ready to say, I'm done being an X-Man, I'm done with this school, I just want to go away. And then we go to the future, where we see the future is a very dark and grim place, and we find out that's all because Cyclops gave up. And then Phoenix sends her ghost back in time and basically psychically nudges Cyclops into saying, no, I'm going to give this one more shot. I'm going to keep being an X-Man. And so she basically fixes the future by going back in time and fixing Cyclops' decision. And so Grant Morrison's run ends with Cyclops saying, okay, let's do this. And then he's kissing Emma Frost. These two issues, it begins with him kissing Emma Frost, and then he says, okay, I want to be with Emma, but I don't want to be an X-Man. And it really feels like Chuck Austen didn't actually read any of Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men. It feels like he saw the art for the very end of that run, and then he wanted to do a two-issue storyline showing Cyclops decide that he is going to give being an X-Men another shot, even though we already saw him make that decision at the end of Grant Morrison's run. So these two issues are basically covering a character arc that we already got in the previous run in the same title. And also, speaking of it feels like Chuck Austen didn't actually read Grant Morrison's run, we have here Beast and Cyclops talking about how Cassandra Nova might be released into the world since Magneto destroyed the school and destroyed the generators, and Cassandra Nova, according to Beast, was being kept imprisoned beneath the school. And this is completely out of line, completely inconsistent with what was given in Grant Morrison's run, where we find out that Charles Xavier and Jean Grey reprogrammed Cassandra Nova and transformed her into a new student at the school who went by the name of Ernst. And we find that out at the very end of his run in the story that's set in the future. We find out that Cassandra Nova is Ernst. Now, I guess it's possible that Charles Xavier did not tell his staff that Cassandra Nova was now a student at their school. That seems possible, especially when you consider all of the times, especially in recent years, such as in Joss Whedon's run on Astonishing X-Men and the Deadly Genesis miniseries by Ed Brubaker. It seems very likely that Charles Xavier did keep more secrets from his staff, such as maybe he didn't tell everyone that Cassandra Nova is a student at the school. And so maybe that's a good way to explain why Beast and Cyclops are looking for Cassandra Nova under the school, even though she would have been one of the students who was somewhere else where all the other students were. It still feels like Chuck Austen didn't actually read that run, and that's why that subplot is here, but that subplot isn't actually dealt with here. And in fairness to Chuck Austen, that subplot isn't as much of a slap in the face to that development in Grant Morrison's run as the way Joss Whedon used Cassandra Nova in his run on Astonishing X-Men. So then we have the final two issues of this book, which is 442 and 443, and this is all set after Magneto, or Zornito. If you go back and watch my video explaining Zorn, you'll see that the Magneto that showed up in Grant Morrison's new X-Men is not the real Magneto, and it was actually a shapeshifter pretending to be Magneto who actually himself thought that he was Magneto. Anyway, at the end of Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men, Magneto basically destroyed most of New York City. And so the last two issues here are Charles Xavier and Logan going to Genosha so that Charles Xavier can bury Magneto's body. And Wolverine is really upset with Charles because he doesn't like Magneto, and he's saying, we don't deserve to bury this guy because he killed a whole bunch of people. And then Polaris comes and she says, okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate. And this whole two-issue storyline is really stupid because it basically takes Polaris and it once again says, yeah, she's crazy under Chuck Austen, because Chuck Austen seems to think that this character needs to be psychotic and that that's an interesting development for her character, which admittedly she didn't really have a character until the very late 80s and throughout the 1990s, and most of the 1990s stuff I haven't even read, so I haven't seen the character of Polaris actually have a personality and a characterization for most of the comics that I've read with her. But I would much rather her have an actual characterization instead of being psychotic, almost murderer, which she kind of almost lapses back into in this two-issue story, because we have Charles Xavier who wants to bury Magneto, and then Lorna comes in and she says, hey, Magneto was right, and here's why he was right. And then her logic for explaining why Magneto was right in doing what he did is so incredibly faulty. Again, it feels like it was written by a 13-year-old. It does not feel very well thought out at all. It feels very, very sloppy in the way that these conclusions are jumped to by Polaris. And then Charles Xavier argues with her, saying, no matter what happens, Magneto's actions were not justified. And then Polaris says she's going to kill Charles Xavier. He says, fine, you can kill me, but I'm still going to be a pacifist. I'm not going to fight back. And then she changes her mind. She says, I don't want to kill you. I love you, Charles. And the whole thing is just written really terribly. And then at the very end, it's kind of sort of setting up the Excalibur series that was going to be written by by Chris Claremont. Wow, I almost called Claremont Charles Xavier. It's setting up the Excalibur series where Charles Xavier and, spoiler, the real Magneto were kind of training a new group of mutants in the ruins of Genosha. And so it's setting that up because everyone, Polaris, Wolverine, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, who had showed up there, they all leave Genosha and they leave Charles Xavier there, and he stays behind to work with Magneto. And that happens there. This book is not as bad as some of the other books in Chuck Austen's run, mostly because some of the major stuff in his run that was so terrible was the relationship stuff that was such a crux in his run, and you don't have to deal with any of that here. You don't have Husk and Archangel being a thing. You don't have Alex and Annie being a thing. You don't have Annie and Iceman being a thing. You don't have any of that. It's just bad superhero stuff, which I would take that any day of the week over bad soap opera stuff that Chuck Austen seemed to be much more interested in writing. So that's all that I have to say about Bright New Morning. It's not the worst thing in Chuck Austen's run, but if you've got some money in your pocket to burn and you want to read an X-Men story that you haven't read before, I would not recommend this one. This one's not written very well. I would recommend that you find something else to read. So that's all that I have to say about this particular volume, and all that I have to say about Chuck Austen's run on Uncanny X-Men. But like I said, I'm not done with Chuck Austen yet. He does have some more X-Men stories in his head that he got out in the other title, and I'll be covering those in a few months probably. But next week, I'm actually going to be doing a different kind of X-Men video, something that I've been wanting to do for a little while now. You'll be seeing that next week, and then the following week, I will be talking about Chris Claremont's Extreme X-Men series, and that will take me a couple months to get through. So that's going to be my X-Men schedule for the next few months. So I hope that you guys will look forward to that. I'm looking forward to to it. And also, I've got some other videos coming out this week. You guys should check those out if you want to. And I will see you guys later. Hope you have a great rest of the day. I'll catch you then.